Change channel here.
Yes.
Is it IGF? They're open networks, huh?
I don't see it. It's weird.
I need to refresh. I see two open networks.
All right.
2025.
I think we're ready to roll. Thanks, everybody. Please take seats. I'm hoping that you can all hear me through your microphones or through the headsets. It's all good? Wonderful. You'll see we're missing one of our panelists, but we decided to start off because we want to have as much time as possible for you all to hear from our wonderful panelists today, and then also to have a chance to open up for your questions and comments as well. This event is focusing on digital rights in partnership, strategies for impact. And we're really looking today to have a really open conversation about the intersection of online experiences and fundamental human rights. We want to highlight the challenges that are faced by civil society, tech companies, and enforcement agencies in protecting these rights within what we all know is a complex, borderless online environment. And we need to recognize, of course, that each of us come to this issue from a different place, that states are the ones that have the legal obligations to take action, but that companies have a duty to respect human rights under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And civil society, of course, is there to keep everybody else honest on both of those obligations, one hopes. So we are going to have a chance to talk a little bit about some of the collaborative projects that are going on in this place, some of the good practices that are happening. And obviously the idea today is to really foster more cross-sector collaboration to strengthen human rights protection in online environments so that we all have a better sense of what we've learned, what we're currently doing, and what we can do more. My name's Peggy Hicks. I work with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. And we too have been working in this space and trying to figure out, what we can contribute. We had a recent event, for example, in Brazil, working with the judiciary on social media regulation. We've done a study within the MENA region, focusing on the experiences of journalists and human rights defenders within the digital platforms. And we do work with our partners within the UN system, including UNESCO, looking at guidance for platforms on human rights impact assessment as an idea. What we find, of course, in this work is that there is obviously a very unlevel playing field with regards to tech regulation in many jurisdictions. We do our best to work to try to bring in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and in particular, the idea within that document that we're looking for a smart mix of mandatory measures and policy incentives that states can put in place. That means that they'll meet not only their obligations to respect human rights, but that they are doing what they need to regulate the space so that companies are also contributing to a more human rights protective environment. We have a project that we'll probably hear a little bit about during this call, looking at which we call the BTEC project, that encourages cross-stakeholder, cross-sector, multi-stakeholder engagement. And it's focused on really trying to work with companies to answer some of the tough questions we see, including around AI and content moderation. And it remains a challenge to figure out how to do this, especially since we're working with some of the largest companies. One of the big questions is how we make this experience more global, how we engage more with small and medium enterprises. And right now, for example, we have a track that's focusing on how do we deal with investors within the tech space as well. We have found, though, through our discussion with the companies, that the work together with them actually has strengthened the way that they work amongst each other, but also that we learn and have a privileged position through what we learn to be able to bring some of what's happening within the companies to a more general audience, for which we're very grateful. We're also, of course, working with the international institutions in this space, including the UN Human Rights Council, and some of the things that come out of that body. And I'll do a shout out now to our host of Norway for a resolution that they passed recently, which is important, that, for example, calls on us to assess the risks faced by human rights defenders through digital technology and do work on that issue. So we're working across these different platforms with our trusted partners to try to have this type of conversation that we're having today, and we're looking forward to doing it in more depth with you. And in order to do that, I'm super privileged to have with us a wonderful panel. I guarantee that the panel will not be composed only of men when Alex Walden from Google arrives soon. So if anybody's taking screenshots, hold up. We've got Alex coming soon, so we'll be a bit more balanced. But today we're very fortunate to have with us, and I'll present to you briefly now, Jason Plemeyer, who we've worked with very closely as the Executive Director of the Global Network Initiative. Ian Barber, to my right, is the Legal and Advocacy Lead at Global Partners Digital. And Esteve Sanz is the Head of Sector for Internet Governance and Multi-Stakeholder Dialogue at the European Commission. So you'll see they come from very different perspectives as well, I think, so it'll be really great to have their different contributions. Alex Walden, who will join us, as I mentioned, is the Global Policy Lead for Human Rights and Freedom of Expression at Google. So we're going to jump right into the conversation. And I'm going to turn to you, Ian, first, and ask you, from the perspective of civil society, what specific challenges do civil society organizations face in advocating for and protecting online human rights when confronted with these pressing issues? Please.
Sure. Thanks, Peggy. Good morning. I hope you guys can all hear me okay. To answer your question, there are a number of challenges that civil society is facing right now, especially in the past few years. It seems pretty critical time. I think one of the biggest ones that we're facing right now is, obviously it's no stranger to everyone here, there's a kind of shrinking for funding that we're finding right now for civil society in this space. Donors simply aren't providing the same amount or completely withdrawing. And this is also reflective of, I think, broader geopolitical changes and realignment that's also not in favor. I think what comes with that as well is there's less of an emphasis on the human rights-based approach. I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of donors are advocating or pursuing for things along the lines of national security or kind of an economic impact, kind of looking for impact investment. So it's reflecting kind of a narrative crisis, I believe, for the human rights-based approach that needs kind of a bit of a rethink at this point for us. And this has kind of impacts not just on civil society in the global north, but particularly civil society in the global majority, which are already less well-resourced and able to make an impact. So I think that's critical to acknowledge. And this leads to, I think, some serious capacity issues. So, of course, with lack of funding, there's less of an ability for civil society across the globe to be able to make an impact. We're seeing this is resulting in layoffs, burnout, and also not having the expertise then to be able to come into these forums and spaces and be able to effectively advocate. We know that there's been a proliferation of forums and processes in the past few years. It's quite difficult to keep up with even kind of the standard ones we've had around for a while. One's based in Geneva, UPR, focused, one's treaty-based, but now, the UN Cybercrime Convention, the AHC, we have WSIS, we have AI governance efforts at this point. So keeping on top of all these things and be able to have them well-resourced with your team is quite difficult. And I think those are kind of the central things we're seeing. And then another big one is also this general erosion, I think, or challenging of this multi-stakeholder approach to governance or policy making. So whether it's at the national level or the regional level or the global level, their CSOs are kind of not able to meaningfully engage and be a part of the decision-making process or be able to input. And there's kind of a lack or a closing of mechanisms that are inclusive and transparent for civil society to be able to engage. And this is problematic because we're seeing then these state-led processes, or an increasingly tendency towards state-led processes that then don't include the expertise and the advocacy points of civil society, including those that are most impacted, including those that are on the ground and have the knowledge that's needed to make effective decisions and frameworks. So I think that's kind of a high-level point. I could go on for a long time, but I think I'll stop there.
Great. No, I think you've hit on many of the points that we're going to dive into deeper during the conversation. And, I want to say just on that last point you made, this idea that when civil society isn't able to put their input, I really want to emphasize that that's not just a disadvantage to civil society who wants to have their voice heard, but to the process itself. And it itself is weakened by the lack of the expertise that civil society and real experience that civil society can bring in. You've hit on some of the things that I think everybody is going to want to come back to eventually as well on the main challenges that we see in the space, which unfortunately are shared, I'm sure, by all of us on the panel and many of you in the audience as well. But I'll turn now to Jason. And obviously, for those that don't know the Global Network Initiative, although I think most people at IGF do, it represents a unique coalition of civil society, academic, investor, and private sector stakeholders. And we'd like to hear more, Jason, about how GNI ensures that diverse perspectives and priorities from all these members are effectively integrated into your strategies for online human rights protection, and maybe give us a concrete example of successful collaborative efforts that you've engaged in. Thanks.
Yeah.
And welcome to Alex, who's joining us. Already introduced you, Alex, so you're with us.
Thanks so much, Peggy. It's a pleasure to be here. Really glad to be a part of this panel, to be here in Norway, to be back at the IGF. Hi to everyone in the audience, both in person and virtually. So I appreciate the opportunity to share a bit more about the Global Network Initiative, GNI, and kind of how we work and how we try to create space for and amplify the voices, in particular, of a really diverse range of stakeholders. As people may know, GNI is a multi-stakeholder organization, so our membership it falls into 4 categories. We call them constituencies. So we have academic members, we have companies, including Google, we have civil society organizations, including Global Partners Digital, and we have investors as members. So it's a very big tent, but it wasn't always that way. When GNI started about 17 years ago, it was a relatively small set of mostly North American and some European organizations. But today we have over 100 members from every populated continent, and we've really made some significant strides to put the global in Global Network Initiative. And that's been very intentional. We've worked really hard over the last decade to reach out to organizations of all types in all kinds of different regions, to be very conscious of the issues that we focus on, the spaces that we curate, the events that we attend, in order to really demonstrate our desire to be a part of a truly global conversation and to bring a diverse range of voices into those conversations. So it's been a really it hasn't been straightforward or necessarily easy to grow the network the way we have, but we've been, we think, quite successful, and really appreciate the sort of range of intelligence and viewpoints and experiences that new members have brought into GNI. So that's really part of what we are about, is trying to build this space, this trusted coalition of organizations that can come together and address difficult challenges in the tech governance realm, and we bring our members together in various ways. We do learning sessions. We have a bespoke accountability process for our companies, and we've made efforts to expand the opportunities for members from across the world to participate in those assessments that we conduct. We also try and go out into the world and attend other events like the IGF, but also regional forums like the Forum for Internet Freedom in Africa, the Digital Rights and Inclusion Forum, regional IGFs all over the world, and hold sessions with our members and with other stakeholders and partners in those settings as well. In terms of an example, I guess one example of how we've grown the network in a way that I think hopefully is having impacts in jurisdictions outside of North America and Europe is the work that we did to bring MTN, the South African telecommunications company, into GNI MTN has been on a journey for several years now, and I think has worked with a range of actors, including, I think, the BTEC project, to understand their responsibilities under the UN guiding principles and other frameworks, and to really build out their own approach to human rights. So they've developed a really robust human rights statement. They joined GNI in 2022. Their transparency report has gotten much deeper and much more detailed. I encourage folks to take a look at that as an example of a really good technology company transparency report. And they are now going through their first GNI assessment. And that has created a lot of opportunity for them to kind of look inward at their systems and policies and understand better the risks related to their business operations, the jurisdictions that they're operating in, and to get important feedback from a wide range of stakeholders through GNI. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk more about any of that as we go through the rest of the panel.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And it's really good to hear about the growth and the way that you've been able to do it. I think Ian had already raised the difficulty, and sometimes there's a commitment to a multi-stakeholder approach, but actually bringing everybody into the room is one of the challenges in doing it in a meaningful way. So your experience in doing that is really good to hear about. I think we'll need to come back a bit more on some of the challenges, including in terms of some of the disincentives for companies to do it. But we're going to actually turn to Alex now, who's got very direct experience with these challenges that companies face in navigating the space. So Alex, if we could hear from you a bit about the significant technical or operational challenges that Google faces in mitigating online harms while simultaneously respecting freedom of expression, including in response to national contexts and government requests. And after that, you get 2 questions. The second is how you're also working to incorporate feedback from civil society organizations and human rights experts into your policies and practices. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. And thanks for bearing with me on my travel from Oslo to Lillestrøm. It's a good question, and I appreciate the framing, because really the challenge is about how do you prevent online harms while you are respecting human rights, in particular freedom of expression, privacy, non-discrimination. So just to censor is not what's difficult. What's difficult is to ensure that you're respecting rights while you are trying to take a tailored approach to removing content that is harmful. So in particular, the 2 things I want to flag are, one, sort of the speed and scale. That is sort of a policy challenge, and it's also obviously a very kind of operational challenge. The amount of content that we have being uploaded to our products every day means that the volume is high, and we need to figure out ways to address that at scale. And so we're using, obviously, there are human moderators that participate in that process, especially for content that requires human kind of context to understand. But we use AI, and we're increasingly using AI to help us do that faster. So again, scale is always, and you'll hear all the companies say this, scale is a challenge, and so figuring out how to address that scale in a responsible way remains an ongoing challenge that we are always sort of iterating on how to do better. The other piece is really the complex regulatory environment, which means that a few things. One, we need safe harbors in order to do this work effectively, to make sure that we are able to implement content moderation practices that are effective and kind of iterate on our policies. And so one is safe harbors and ensuring that we have regulatory protections in order to allow us to do that. The other piece is about sort of ensuring that we don't have obligations for general monitoring or for sort of pre-scanning of content, because that leads to censorship and over-removal. So again, that's the type of provision that we hope not to see in regulations, but we do continue to see sort of over and over. And So ultimately, and I guess the other piece is sort of conflicting regulations from around the world. And so as we're a global company, our services are offered everywhere. And so we are always working to figure out sort of global approaches to how we address the scale of the problem, while also figuring out how to navigate this sort of really complex global regulatory environment, where certainly many well-meaning governments are in this conversation with us trying to figure out how to address the problem, but there are some sort of regulatory protections that we need in place, and also to ensure that both governments and companies are respecting rights as they're doing this work. In terms of how we engage stakeholders and take feedback, there's a few things I'd say. On the largest scale, there's, it's important for companies to show up to venues where our stakeholders are so that we can participate in conversations with them and make sure that we're hearing from them in that context. So things like IGF, venues like RightsCon, showing up there and being part of the conversation and hearing what the concerns are from stakeholders, those sort of being present is an important thing for us to do at those large venues. Then it's about being part of organizations where sort of more curated versions of that conversation is taking place. So GNI is being a member of GNI and engaging in GNI is a really important way in which we do that as Google, a place where we have core stakeholders that are talking about these issues and the trade-offs all the time. And then specifically, just Google as an individual company, we have programs in place, part of the human rights program, as well as along with our trust and safety colleagues, ensuring that we are doing regional stakeholder meetings and stakeholder meetings with our sort of global colleagues as well, to make sure that we're hearing directly from experts in the field about what's happening in their region, what their experience is with our products, how things are working or are not working, and ensuring that that feedback is going directly to the teams that are drafting our policies, enforcing our policies, and building our products.
Great. Thanks very much, Alex. I mean, I think this area of stakeholder engagement and what works and what doesn't is one of those that we have to keep iterating and improving on. We did a BTEC paper on this that people might want to refer to with sort of the 5 key principles. But one of the things we found talking to all of you is that there are good practices and there are ways to improve, and that I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But we need to move over, and I'm really glad to have with us another perspective coming from the European Commission, SFS. We'd really like to hear about sort of the how does international cooperation play in the European Commission strategy to protect online human rights, especially with countries and regions outside the EU, and how that might contribute to the WSIS Plus 20 process, and how you're looking at the EU's role in this important space. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Sorry. I am very glad to be in this panel, the European voice in the panel. Digital and human rights are an absolute priority for the EU. We've been working on it for a long, long time. We have focused especially on getting agreements at the global level, including the Global Digital Compact, the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, etc., that really commit states and critical actors to respect digital human rights, not censor the Internet, not doing Internet shutdowns, etc. There is a very important achievement that we did in the Global Digital Compact that commits states in the UN not to shut down the Internet. At the same time, there is a gap here. We have done a lot of analysis, also engage academics and civil society to help us understand what's going on in the ground when it comes to states using the Internet for control. I think that we are in a new stage where the Internet is not only controlled, but it's used for control. And what we see is a very depressing trajectory. So there is this gap that it's very puzzling between the diplomatic achievements that we are managed to do in committing global actors, very powerful global actors, to respect fundamental freedoms online, and what's going on in reality. So this is it's very damaging. This is a diagnostic that we have on the table. We have engaged in several funding exercises. We have the Global Initiative for the Future of the Internet that has a project that we call Internet Accountability Compass that will help us precisely analyze this gap of, what we are committing into and what's really going on in terms of digital repression. And this is extremely, extremely important for us. Every time that we engage on human rights and digital dialogues with countries, we bring up digital depression. That's very important for us. When there is a big event, an internet shutdown, we engage in public diplomacy as well, in Iran, in Jordan, so we have call out for internet shutdowns there. And there is a lot of investment as well. So we have, for example, projects like protectdefenders.eu, which provides funding in case of urgent need for journalists and other civil society actors. We work a lot with you, Peggy, right? So we have a lot of funding and projects in common, one on internet shutdown, several funding projects that really aim at empowering OHCHR to play a critical role in this field. So yes, this is all going on. We are very much aware of the funding situation. There are a lot of internal discussions within the EU how we can step up our role in that area, because we feel that this is going to be really dramatic if we don't act soon. Of course, discussions related to funding are always extremely delicate in any public administration, and it's not difficult, but I can assure you that we have achieved some successes already, and more funding will be flowing. Whether the EU can cover all the funding that is being extracted from those organizations, it's of course an open question, but it has really sent a signal that the EU should step up, I would say. So on the WSIS plus 20 review, this is very important. It links with what I was explaining at the beginning, that we have actually achieved a lot of things when it comes to UN discussions about states committing to defend digital rights, etc. But then when we see, it's a bit puzzling. WSIS plus 20 review will double up on those efforts. So what EU member states have discussed, and this is how we will go to the negotiations of the outcome document, is to really take stock of the rise of digital authoritarianism. This has been presented by our ambassador to the UN already, so acknowledging that digital authoritarianism is on the rise, and this has to be acknowledged. And then, based on that, propose what we aim, what we hope will be unprecedented language at the UN level in the WSIS plus 20 resolution on digital human rights. So this language, it's still object of discussions, internal discussions. We will probably publish a non-paper with that language that, again, we hope it's not part of any UN resolution, because the challenges are so high that we need to move up. Part of that language will be, for sure, going much more concretely into statements that protect journalists, civil society, etc., from digital repression. But that's our aim. It's a public aim. It's very ambitious. It's very difficult to achieve and pull off, but we, of course, count on like-minded partners and stakeholders who will need to be participating very intensively in the WSIS plus 20 resolution to do that. We think that the context is really the good one, so that we can achieve at least that. But again, the reality might be different than whatever the outcome document of WSIS declares. So important to bear in mind that gap.
Oh, thank you, Esteban. It's really interesting to hear your comments about the disconnect between where we get to in terms of international commitments and what we see in the world. And I think we feel that on the financial side as well, where the demand for action, for work in this area just grows exponentially, but we are facing some of the challenges that you mentioned. I want to loop back just quickly to Ian, and then I'm going to have a question for everybody, and then we're coming directly to you all quickly. Ian, I wanted to ask you, when you look at collaboration from a civil society perspective, what is civil society looking for? What does it need from governments, tech companies, and other stakeholders in order to advance human rights protection? Where have you seen good collaboration happening?
Great. Well, I just want to say that there's a lot of great collaboration already on the table from these individuals and from their remarks, so I just want to acknowledge that. But also, I think at the end of the day, the most impactful forums are going to be those that truly shift power and resources back to civil society and allow them to engage. So from governance, we've already alluded to this, it's ensuring that those policy processes, whether it's national, regional, or global, that they're actually inclusive, they're bringing in those voices, that there's input that's received, it's acknowledgement, and there's a feedback loop as well. So that's key. I think also funding we've hit on already is a key metric, and also kind of recommitting to human rights obligations themselves, of course, when things do happen. From companies, I think that they can really operationalize their commitments through transparency and access. That can come in a variety of forms. It can come to access to data. It can be on their impact assessments. It can be enforcement practices. Also can be this kind of iterative multi-stakeholder engagement with groups that are in different regions that are more at risk. Those are going to be key as well. And I think they kind of lead to this co-design and co-development of policy and governance and frameworks that we want to see. And I think for more multi-stakeholder coalitions like GNI, and again, these things are already very much being done, is there's definitely a collaboration deficit that I'm seeing. So there's a recognition that we have challenges, but really there's not always structural support then to address them. So what you need to do is then champion equity in partnerships, as Jason has alluded to. It's bringing in voices from the global majority of the global south and civil society as co-leaders that are then engaging in advocacy and agenda setting, not just kind of tokenism. It's facilitating access to knowledge and sharing that so that engagement can be effective and realized. And it also, there's a need to do this to kind of like build a gap of trust, I think, among stakeholders across different areas, because without it, we're going to have a situation where the structures don't support everyone, and there's no final effective impact, and it's, again, this symbolic means of doing things. So I think that's kind of a cross response there, but yeah.
No, that's great, and I think it's really important to make that point that it's got to be intentional. You have to put the resources and effort into it if you're going to really make things work in a more global way, like Jason talked about with GNI. So before I turn to the audience, I do want to ask one sort of lightning round question of all of you, because you started off, Ian, by noting that we're navigating this human rights field in the midst of two really oppressive almost pressures from both the securitization side, where all that matters is the cyber crime convention, as we showed, looking, and David Kay was just talking about how we make exceptions for anything that may be, relevant from the national security side. And then I think even more prevalent now is this rationale around the competition, innovation, economic side, where anything that stands in the way, and human rights are sometimes seen as obstacles or barriers to come over, means that companies and other stakeholders, including governments, seem somewhat less invested in answering some of the questions we're asking today than they have been, for me at least, at prior IGFs. So I wondered how you're looking at that, and when you get that type of pressure that, why should we focus on doing it the multi-stakeholder way and bringing in civil society, and why does it matter to make sure that we're building in human rights within the digital tech work that we do, given that we have these competing tensions around national security and the need for greater competition and effective innovation? Give me, your 30-second answer to that that you use, which I'm sure comes up quite frequently in everybody's lines of work. So maybe just to go this way. Start with you, Alex.
Never comes up for me.
No, never.
I think, you just hit on these things that are sort of part of my internal and external conversations every day. From my perspective, and what I say to my colleagues inside the company and my stakeholders outside, is we have to be able to we have to figure out how to, and to focus on all of these things at the same time in order to achieve national security interests, in order to focus on ongoing innovation and have competition in the market. We have to ensure that human rights is integrated across those conversations and remains a priority. States have a duty to uphold their obligations to human rights. And so it is imperative that they, in those conversations about regulation, about how they use AI as part of their public sector, ensure that they're upholding sort of that obligation. And companies also have a duty to do that too. But I think sort of there's a role for everyone, and it is imperative that governments do it first in order to sort of set the stage for all of the other actors to be able to show up and do their part. Companies are providing technology to governments for national security purposes, and we need to know that governments are thinking about their human rights obligations in the context of when they're procuring that. So I think there's a lot of good guidance out there. BTEC has done some of it already in thinking about procurement and how companies should be thinking about their human rights obligation, but really, we have to do all of them at the same time.
Great, thanks, Alex. Ian?
Yeah, I think just building on what Alex said, for me, when I'm speaking to governments or any other stakeholder, I kind of challenge them to say that, actually, I don't think human rights approaches and outcomes and security or whatnot are even potentially even opposing things. They can be very much mutually reinforcing concepts. They can support one another. So to kind of fold them in is kind of a creative way sometimes to Trojan horse to get kind of this funding, which is essential. And I think that really what it comes down to is then, as well as that, you do need, as a final point, civil society in the room to bring that expertise, to bring the knowledge and the know-how to be able to arrive at these solutions. So it's kind of challenging and rejigging the narrative, and then also ensuring that those people are at the table.
Great, thanks. Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I guess two things. One, taking a step back, I just had sort of an interesting kind of mental moment because, Steve, when you were talking, you said digital repression, and I heard digital depression. And I think that's because of the comments that we heard initially from Ian and just generally how a lot of us are feeling these days, which I want to acknowledge is real. So we're dealing with both digital repression and digital depression. But I think it's really important to remind ourselves that, and this audience probably doesn't need this reminder as much as maybe others, but that the internet is still an incredibly vibrant and critical space, especially when you compare it to offline mediums for free expression and freedom of association and assembly. And that's something we sometimes forget, right? We can look at the annual Freedom House, Freedom on the Net reports, which are excellent, and see this trend towards declining freedom. And it's real, and we have to acknowledge it. But if you compare offline and online realities for people in even and maybe especially the most repressed places on earth, there's a real reason why they cling to the social media spaces, the open internet, that they are able to access, whether it's finding cracks through the repressive laws in their country or using anti-censorship technologies to get access to the open internet. And we don't have to look far and just look at the example of Iran today to see that reality. So I want to just kind of infuse that sort of optimism or hope that there is still something worth fighting for. There's a reason why it's important to have these important statements from governments, even if they're not always living up to them in practice. There's a reason why we continue to get together in these multi-stakeholder settings to talk about what we can do, even if it's easier sometimes to sort of give in to cynicism and digital depression. So not an answer to your question, but something that I feel like we needed to kind of just remind ourselves of.
Very helpful. Essen.
Every time that there is a legislation that deals with digital in the EU, we strive, of course, to find the right balance between security, between all these elements. The legislative process in the EU, it's a complex one. The Parliament is involved, civil society. There are a lot of consultations, the Council, the Commission, there is a proposal. So it's a very complex, almost miraculous way of doing legislation that yields something like the Digital Services Act, which is perhaps the cornerstone of our digital regulation right now. That, as you well know, it's an all-of-society approach. That's what we call it. The legislation itself has pieces that are aimed at involving civil society into the process of governance of the platforms themselves. There are transparency provisions, users can complain about takedown of content, etc. So the balance that we found in the legislative process when it comes to the Digital Services Act, we think it's extremely valuable. Of course, we are pitching it to our partners globally. Bearing in mind that each region, each country has its own approach, but so far I think that we have managed to find that approach. That is something very important for us in the EU legislative system, which is the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So whatever legislation we put on the table, whatever proposal is on the table, it needs to comply with the Charter, and having that Charter as the ultimate element that frames everything that we do in the EU, but especially on digital, has been very valuable because in the end, it shows us a path towards finding that balance correctly.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So I'm going to jump quickly now to our audience to see if any of you have any, we've provoked any thoughts from any of you that you'd like to put on the table, or any questions for our panel here. I'm not exactly sure how the tech here works. It looks like there's microphones alongside. I think you probably need to go to one of those. If anybody will give me a thumbs up, that's how we're supposed to do it?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, I see movement. Looking forward to hearing the comment of the gentleman. Nope, he's just leaving. Bye. Anybody want to come in? Trust me, we can keep the conversation going amongst ourselves. I know these guys, but happy to hear from you. I know it's a little awkward to have to get out of your chairs. All right, I'll come back to you all. So I think Jason did something good, which is I think it is one of those spaces where it's important for us to look for good examples and to put ideas on the table that we think are things that we want to see replicated. So if you had to just give me an idea of an incentive or something that you think you want to see more of that you've seen, you know, either in a particular context in which you've worked, give me some good examples that we can leave our audience with today. Alex, can I start with you?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, one thing I'll flag just because maybe it's top of mind and recent, and because it hits on some of the DSA things too, is I think GNI and DTSP, who's another organization that works with companies around risk assessment and harms issues, convened a Risks and Rights Forum in Brussels last month, and that was an opportunity for all of the companies who are members of GNI and DTSP, who are also VLOPs and VLOSs under the DSA, to come together and have conversations about the assessments that are now public and all of the information that's in that. And so to really kind of, we have a lot of actual sort of artifacts that we can discuss and talk about the challenges and what people want to see more of from companies. And so I think fora, where we have a lot of sort of material that we can talk through and have really like open, transparent conversation between civil society and companies, is like, that was I think it's a really excellent example of how we can kind of, we have a piece of regulation where it's in action and talking amongst the stakeholders about what's working, what's not, and how we can improve. So that's just a recent one that I think is really pressing, especially for companies in particular.
Great. No, I think that's really an important point, Alex. And to me, it also gives rise to something that I often think in this space, which is that evidence-based, that idea of going beyond the general conversation to really talk about some specific case studies. Something went wrong, putting what went wrong on the table sometimes and unpacking it and figuring out how to do better is really important. And I know within our work where we do peer review amongst companies similarly situated, we have some really, really frank and useful conversations that can push things forward. But you can't do that if you stay at the 10,000 feet level. Ian?
Yeah, I think I want to mention the kind of precedent of modalities and process and procedure that we've seen. So in the AHC, the negotiations of the UN Cybercrime Convention, in both a formal and informal way, there's kind of evidence, even if the final output wasn't what we would have been looking for, that you can use this kind of existing basis moving forward in other forums. So the modalities of the AHC was a bit more open for civil society and others to engage and provide input and have that be taken in and speak for the UN, which is great. And then also informally, there's a brain trust organization group that was working with companies across stakeholder lines to kind of advance our central aims. So I think that those two examples have been used then in other UN processes and forums to kind of replicate it, to then build in a more multi-stakeholder approach to things, which I think is excellent. And also a selfless plug, which is GPD is now working for the WSIS review, coordinating the Global Digital Rights Coalition, working with CSOs in the Global North and Global South, which you've seen as good practice, and other stakeholders. So we'll be doing that moving forward. So another positive note to hopefully end on.
Great, thanks. I'm going to skip over you, Jason. I'm going to go to Esteve because you already put yours on the table. I'll give you another chance, though. Go ahead.
So, in April, we organized global multi-stakeholder conference on what we call the governance of Web 4.0, which is essentially the impact of AI, quantum, etc., on the internet. So that global impact of those very powerful technologies, blockchain, etc., into the global internet, not the governance itself of these technologies. This was a very well-attended and very intense conference, and there was a very prominent human rights angle. And what emerged from that is actually a series of principles that were object of consensus or rough consensus among the conference participants that basically set the ground so that we can continue being optimist in the context of this future internet, which is, the stakes are much higher, right? What you can do with AI in terms of repression is massive. what you can do with AI in terms of freedom of speech and liberation and analysis of bureaucratic processes so that you empower citizens, etc., it's also massive. So what we set up after that conference were this series of principles that set the ground to, well, while we see the future internet emerging, if we want to continue seeing the internet, because this is not a given, the internet, it's what we make out of it, right? If we want to make that space to continue to be a tool for self-expression and for freedom and for democracy, etc., these are the principles that we think we should follow. So this was very, it leaves us with a lot of optimism because it was relatively easy to, of course, not every stakeholder was in that table, but it was relatively easy to come up with a series of principles that would chart a good path. So this is also impacting our position in the WSIS plus 20 negotiations. We will bring up these higher stakes when it comes to these very powerful technologies impacting the internet, that if we don't set things right, then things can go massively wrong very, very easily. And we hope that this is acknowledged in the UN context as well.
Great. Back to you, Jason.
Yeah, maybe just mention one other collaboration across this table. The Rights and Risk Forum and the work we're doing on the Digital Services Act and also trying to think about how we continue to ensure that not just the risk assessments under the DSA, but those under the Online Safety Act and other digital regulations remain consistent with the UN guiding principles and broader international human rights frameworks. But also, we've been working recently with GPD to empower civil society voices from the global majority to be more engaged in the WSIS process, precisely so that we can support the kinds of initiatives that it sounds like the EU is eager to put forward and make sure that these are not just seen as sort of Western approaches that don't resonate and have support across the world. Just today, I think we'll be publishing a series of reports from the partners in 9 different countries. We've done workshops at lightning pace over the last 2 months around the world with civil society actors in these different countries to help inform a wider audience and involve a wider group of stakeholders in the input processes to WSIS. Obviously, that work will continue over the next several months until the end of this year when the WSIS process concludes. But I think it's really important to emphasize WSIS as, being here at the IGF as just such a critical moment for this community, given that all of these new technologies are creating opportunities for governance to go in different directions, and that direction could learn from and build on and incorporate the sort of multi-stakeholder human rights-based values that we have successfully collectively pioneered as a community, or they could go in a different direction. And so it's really a fork in the road, not a phrase that I like to use anymore given the way it's been misappropriated, but I think it's a critical time for us to be here together at the IGF, and I really appreciate all of the panelists here sort of speaking about how we can continue to work towards that WSIS outcome that will sort of reinvigorate the multi-stakeholder approach.
Great, thanks. And you jumped ahead again, which I think is really good. It shows we're on the same track, because the next thing I wanted to ask, and I don't see anybody lined up at the mic yet. Maybe somebody back there. Please come over and do it. I'll throw out my question too, and I'll let you all choose. A number of you have focused on the difficulty sometimes in making sure that both the resources and the engagement is happening as effectively outside of Europe and a global north context, and figuring out how more can be done both to reap the benefits of digital technology, but also to make sure that the tools and resources needed to have the types of conversations and engagement that we need in places without as many resources, how we can better make sure that that is happening. So wanted to get your thoughts on that, but turning to our colleague here first, please.
Thank you. Alejandro from Access Now. And I think very related to that comment is what are the accountability mechanisms for these type of partnerships, especially when you're working in the global south and it's very easy for global north actors to disengage when these type of partnerships are happening. So in your experiences, what are those accountability mechanisms that we can create?
Great question. Thank you very much. So I will maybe just Jason, you want to start on that one? Because you're doing quite a bit.
Sure. So I think accountability can take a lot of different forms. To Alejandro's question, I think there are, in GNI, for instance, we have an accountability mechanism that is built in to hold companies to the commitments that they make. And that's a process that involves sort of very detailed review of internal company systems and policies with independent assessors. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we've been working really hard to sort of build more opportunities for a wider group of GNI members to be a part of those conversations. I think at the sort of multilateral level, the question of accountability has always been a somewhat vexing one. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights does a really important, plays a very important role in calling out where states fall short of their commitments. But more tangible legal processes are lacking in many contexts. We do have, obviously, committees related to different treaty bodies that can produce reviews. We have the Universal Periodic Review. We have the special mandates. So it's not a barren field, but it is also one that is not, that still could be sowed with, I think, more seeds. I don't know. I'll stop trying to torture that analogy. And I think for some of these other spaces, whether it's the IGF itself as a venue for collaboration or the WSIS process, the Global Digital Compact, it's an open question, right? How do we ensure that not just the states that are producing the final text, but the other stakeholders who are committing themselves and involving themselves in those processes continue to carry them out? Part of it involves being at places like the IGF where we can continue to sort of stand on stages and have to answer to audiences about what we've done since we made these commitments. Part of it involves, I think, funding and being able to have support for watchdogs like Access Now and others in civil society. So it's going to take a lot of different tools, but I think at least in this space, we have more forums and venues like this, which we sometimes take for granted, but I think we need to double down and sort of reinvest in.
Esther, you want to say a few words on accountability side?
I think what we have witnessed already, but we will continue witnessing, is the abuse of digital legislations, and this includes also potential UN instruments. And really, to hold states accountable for not abusing those digital legislations, you need a civil society approach, because this will be very difficult to trace. It will be untransparent by definition. If you don't get journalists, civil society activists, etc., to call out those abuses, it's going to get very difficult at the global level to trace that, because again, we are having this legitimacy gap between what it's written, the safeguards, etc., and what we see in practice. And there is a fundamental problem of complexity and transparency that either you engage the multi-stakeholder community to tackle that, or we will simply not know.
And I think that's a lead-in for you, Ian, to both look at the accountability question from a civil society side and the role that it plays.
Yeah, I mean, civil society can play a key role in, as was noted, serving as kind of a watchdog or an observer even, and one that can then bring the issues or problems to light to the broader community, I think is a central component and one that's kind of overlooked in a way. And I think that when you're speaking about accountability in general, a lot of this comes down to transparency, openness, and decision-making in the processes and what's been done and moving forward. And this should not just be a one-off event, as been alluded to. It should be done in an iterative and ongoing way and in different manners. So I'll keep it short and sweet.
And Alex, on your side, the company side?
Yeah, I mean, I think at least for GNI companies, Jason hit on a key piece for us, which is the independent assessment that we have as members of GNI. And so that's a key way in which we are looking to ensure that we have accountability for our commitment to principles, the GNI principles in particular, and then obviously being transparent about our commitment to the UNGPs and how that manifests across our products. That looks like qualitative transparency about what our policies are, quantitative transparency about how we're implementing them, or enforcement measures, et cetera. And that's not just for global majority, that's the entire world and how we're enforcing that. Obviously, we have the Digital Services Act in Europe, and so that is a sort of beginning entree of what sort of a risk assessment, a report that becomes public can look like. And so I think we're all learning about what the value of something like that is for the purposes of accountability in a regulatory setting as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and thanks so much for the question, because I think it's one where we really are learning now, and I think that's an important thing to say. How useful are some of these tools going to be? Do they provide the value that we need? I think Ian's point about the transparency piece is absolutely crucial, that without transparency, we don't get to accountability very easily, but I'm sure there's more we can do, and I'm sure Access Now will help us to figure it out. So thanks so much for the comment. And I'm getting the signal that we're going to have to draw the session to a close. In doing so, I really want to thank those that are responsible for the organizing of it, which was not my office, but Christina Herrera from Google and Erlingson from Adapt, who brought us all together today. We're very glad to have a chance to talk through these issues with you. I hope you come away from it with some good ideas on potential collaboration, comments that you want to follow up on in the course of IGF going forward, and obviously feel free to reach out to any of the panelists to get more information on some of those good practices that we've discussed. Thanks so much for joining us today.